finishing up his tenure in the club to take up what can't be nearly such a good tenure as Auditor General. And Mark Wheeler appears to have given him 5 minutes to make his excuses. So as a first step, before we hear our guest speaker, over to you, Martin.
Thank you, Lee. I'm not sure it's the club's tradition for folks to get, I suppose, a valedictory opportunity, but Mark said to me he thought it might be nice if I were able to just say a few words about the role that I'm going to and just some reflections on my time in Rotary. Because I'm stepping down, as Lee has just mentioned, because on Wednesday morning I have my first day as Auditor General, and the statutory requirements for that position are that I be completely independent and free of conflict, whether perceived or real. So I'm at this point sort of stopping my association with anything that could cause such suggestion. I've really enjoyed my time in the club, and I think it's great to be part of the fellowship of Rotary, but also the outstanding things that this club is responsible for. So what I'd like to do is tell you a little bit about the role I'm going to, but also some reflections and some challenges, I suppose, for you as the stewards of the club and the future of the club. So the role of Auditor General is one that many of you have probably heard of. It's often referred to as Parliament's watchdog. I hope, Lee, that maybe you or Mark or someone else might invite me back at some point to talk in a little bit more detail about what I hope to do as Auditor General, but let me just comment briefly on that. I'll be what is known as an Officer of Parliament. The role, I think, sits at the heart of our constitutional arrangements. It's about ensuring that the government, both central and local, is operating in accordance with the authority of Parliament, using taxpayer and ratepayer resources wisely, and is accountable both to Parliament and to the public for these things. These are not matters, I think, that most people think about every day, but they are things that I've had a deep and abiding interest in for a very long time, having started my career in the office. And it's because I believe that public trust and confidence in government is really dependent on effective public management and accountability. And I think they are at the heart of preserving an effective parliamentary democracy. So these are the reasons why I think it's so important. But I also think we're on the cusp of some very significant change. We need, in my view, to rethink many aspects of our system of public management and accountability. I think we need to rethink them if they're going to remain fit for purpose for the coming decades. Much of what we have today was designed in the late 1980s, now nearly 30 years ago. And a lot has changed in the last 30 years. And I'm not convinced that the arrangements we have today will be fit for purpose for the second quarter of the 21st century. The second quarter will be what follows about the end of my term as Auditor General. I think the recent experience of both Brexit and the US elections demonstrate that there are large sections of the electorate in both of those countries that would seem to be, or at least feel, disenfranchised. Those folks clearly do not trust government. They do not trust the information that they're getting from government about what government does or its performance. They are, I think, more inclined to believe those people who tell them what they perceive or believe to be true, however inaccurate that may be. So I want to use my term as Auditor General to provide some stronger leadership about the future of public management and accountability in New Zealand. And these comments are pertinent to how I think about the future of Rotary and some of the challenges I want to leave with you, because I think Rotary and the Rotary Club of Wellington needs to be open also to new ways of thinking about how it achieves its mission. You see, I think the club has great prospects for the future, especially if it's focused first and foremost on its purpose, to be a force for good in Wellington. People and businesses have changed a lot over recent decades. And I think the practices of Rotary as we know them today are becoming increasingly outdated. But we also know that newer generations are showing they still want to give back to their communities, but they want to do it in ways that don't necessarily align with the traditions of practice and practices of Rotary as it is today. And yet, I think the values of Rotary to put service before self and the four-way test remain relevant and consistent with the values of those newer generations. So in that regard, Rotary has, I think, a wonderful opportunity to leverage both the alignment of its purpose and its values with those newer generations, but only if it can redefine the way it works and what it means to be a Rotarian. I think this will require the club to really think and challenge itself about how it operates. It will need to work very differently to attract people who want to serve their community and to enjoy the fellowship of those others who want to serve their community. The focus needs to be much less on weekly meetings and much more on an operating structure that attracts those people who only have time to give to their community. The club has an enormous legacy from nearly 100 years of serving Wellington and New Zealand. As the current stewards of the club, we have a responsibility to position the club to do that for another 100 years. But that will require new thinking and different thinking. And I encourage you all, as the stewards of the club, to be open to that new thinking so that we can start the second century being confident that the club will be here in 100 years from now, being a force for good for Wellington. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. In the times that we live at the moment, and with what is happening in particular in the US, roles of the Auditor General get almost like in Technicolor. And so too in the last few days is the potential for the role of judges in the rule of law. So I'll ask Derek to introduce our speaker for this evening, please.
Well, it's not just 25 years plus since the Public Finance Act was passed and the States Eater Act passed, Martin. It's also 25 years since we passed the Children and Young Person and Their Families Act. And the CYMPF Act had a major innovation, which was a world first, which was the Family Group Conference. If anyone's had familiarity with that, it was an absolute sea change in the way the state helped families deal with difficult situations and empowered them. It also marked a shift away from a punitive to a more restorative justice approach. So it was an absolute world first. 25 years on, plus, I think the title of your address is the more we know, the harder it gets. And I think that's a really good theme for youth justice. You know, the more we know now a lot through big data about the life courses of people that end up in care and protection and youth justice. We know if you go through that system, your chances of ending up in jail are 400 times, say that again, 400 times the life chances of a kid chosen at random from the same cohort. So the more we know, the harder it gets. So what the focus of, so we're very lucky to have the Chief Youth Court Judge, John Walker, who's going to talk to us about the more we know, the harder it gets and what we might do about that.
Tēnā koutou and good evening to you all. Can I begin by paying tribute to the work that you do as members of Rotary? I know that the membership of Rotary clubs around the country comprises those who have contributed much to their communities, continue to contribute much to their communities, are heavily involved in various activities and businesses and endeavours, yet you still find the time to give back to communities on and on again and you deserve the thanks of the community for everything that you do. I've heard some of the projects that you are involved in, particularly in Wellington, including the migrant employment and qualification project, and it's just a sort of contribution for which everyone should be grateful. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak tonight. Some of what I want to talk to you about may be depressing. It's almost like I should put a warning above my title. Warning may contain depressing material. When I talk about youth offending and the complexities of the young lives that we confront in our youth courts, it can be depressing, but only so if it is thought that there is nothing we can do about it. The youth court, with its multidisciplinary, solution-focused approach, based, as you have heard, on a process involving family group conferencing and restorative justice elements, has a focus on getting to the root causes of offending. It is actually a place of enormous hope, and often described as a place where there are merchants of hope. I remember a young child at a marae in Porirua when I was speaking to a group of young people, and when it came time for questions, this young girl said to me, "Did I think it was possible ever to change?" She was about 12 or 13, and it was sadness for me to think that a young person could be thinking that they were just where they were, that their trajectory would just be as it was for everybody around her, and that there was really no hope for change. I don't know whether she got any solace from me saying that of course she could, but we know of course she could. A typical picture of a youth offender coming before the court will often be of a child who has been under the care of child, youth and family for many, many years, who may have suffered traumatic brain injury, been involved in too many fights, been assaulted in the family, been involved in car accidents, who may suffer from neurodisability, such as fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, which is emerging in larger and larger numbers, or autism, or communication disorder, or dyslexia, who has early onset of mental illness and suffers from alcohol and other drug dependency. Often a young person will come to court with more than one of those major obstacles to life, and they will be probably disengaged from education. Our youth courts now have in the courtroom, in the multidisciplinary teams with which we operate, mental health nurses and alcohol and other drug clinicians as part of the team. When I started job as a judge in 1994, it was thought that you couldn't have a diagnosis of mental illness if you were adolescent. Now we have adolescent mental health units and specialist adolescent health practitioners and drug and alcohol clinicians and mental health nurses in our courts. The behaviours that we are seeing, the disabilities that we are noting, are well established by the time a young person comes into the youth court, typically at 14 or 15 years of age. In the youth court, we are often playing a game of catch-up, endeavouring to fashion responses to underlying issues which have been around for years and years and years. But I want you to hold on to the thought of this complex young person that I have described, because I want to add another layer, and that is exposure to family violence. In the last few years in my work as a judge, I've been heavily involved in the district court in two areas. One is enhancing the way the district court responds to family violence and improving the way we respond to youth offending in our courts. And I have seen these efforts as two separate things. I was dealing with family violence, often severe violent behaviour by adults, sometimes life-threatening, the controlling act of non-fatal strangulation. I'm not killing you, but I could, towards a partner or towards the partner's and or the perpetrator's children. Behaviour that takes place inside the home, often repeated over and over again, and with its particular complicated dynamics. So that was one piece of work. And then in dealing with youth offending, being confronted by seriously disturbing behaviour by young people, ram raiding of service stations, aggravated robberies, gratuitous serious violence, often by what we would describe as children, and increasingly not just boys, but girls as well, aged as young as 12 or 13. But it has become clear that there is a real connection between these two areas, between exposure to family violence and violent offending. And it's that connection that I want to explore with you tonight. I thought it was complex enough when I looked at the neurodisabilities and the underlying causes that I described at the beginning of this address. It's become even more complex when I realised this very real connection between family violence and youth offending in a violent way. Family violence is an endemic issue in New Zealand. Let me give you the latest figures we have. In 2015, there were over 110,000 family violence investigations by New Zealand police. That is, the police turned up at a house on a complaint of family violence. It used to be called a domestic incident, and purposefully the police have changed the description to a family violence investigation to give it the level of seriousness that it deserves. There is a call for police services in relation to family violence every 6 minutes of every day. In New Zealand, children are present at about half of all family violence call-outs by police. And police report that in approximately 70% of family units where intimate partner violence exists, children are also direct victims of some form of violence. Now, if you think those figures are bad enough and concerning enough, you need to consider the police estimate that only 20% of family violence is ever reported to the police. So the numbers become deeply concerning when we're talking about the children who are involved. Tens of thousands of children in New Zealand are growing up in a climate of violence. And the effects of being subject to violence within the home, or of witnessing violence or hearing the violence, are severe. Physically, emotionally, and developmentally. What do these effects include? Well, they're not limited to these, but these are some of them. Anxiety, fear, depression, toxic stress, aggression in their own behaviour, post-traumatic stress disorder and all that gives rise to, emotional and behavioural problems that are exhibited, and impaired social skills. all of these consequences can have a big part to play in how young people behave in relation to others and how they resolve conflicts that might occur. There are also some more subtle consequences of experiencing or witnessing family violence in the home. A child may learn that violence is normal, is an effective way of getting what you want, and is a marker of power and prestige. A child may learn to disrespect women with violent actions and words, or that violent behaviour is a normal part and parcel of an intimate relationship. Children learn from adults. A research project was conducted in 2011 in the Tasman district, Nelson, Motueka, called the Girls Project. It was looking at the emergence of violence by young women and examined the origins of violent behaviour by school-age girls. And it noted that familiarity with family violence meant these girls were more likely to form relationships with like-minded partners, to be more accepting of their behaviour because they had seen it and it had become normalised for them, and so to end up themselves in violent, intimate relationships. One example in that project was a girl who was given the name of Gina. She would be now 16, and the authors noted that she at that time had more assault charges against her than her age. She explained, "I would get a hiding probably twice a day from my mum's partners for standing up for my mum. I've been unconscious twice from mum's partners." At 15, Gina moved in with her boyfriend. She describes the relationship: "He kicks me, he drags me on the ground, he punches the living out of me, he strangled me, he's put me in hospital." She tried to stay at school while all this was happening, but during the day her boyfriend hounded her through phone calls and texts, the controlling behaviour so much part of family violence. Then one day, ignoring the teacher's warning to put away her phone, because he was calling her, she snapped at the teacher, threw a chair at her, and she ended up beating her around the head severely. This was learned behaviour in a situation where violence was part of her daily life and had been for a long time. The family is key to socialisation. It's where children learn strategies for dealing with conflict and challenges. In my view, we cannot address youth violence, including that which escalates to adult criminal justice system, if we do not address family violence. There's another way by which children are exposed to family violence, and that is through its effects being filtered to the child through the mother in utero. If a mother is subject to family violence during pregnancy, always hyper-vigilant about what's going to happen next, the constant release of a mother's stress hormone, cortisol, is unhealthy, to say the least, for a growing fetus. While in utero, the developmental health of the fetus depends on the health of the mother. And if the fetus has been flooded with cortisol, it has a serious developmental effect. It used to be thought that a child was safe in the womb. Not so. We already know about the effects of alcohol consumption in pregnancy, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, which we're seeing more and more of in our youth court. Now we know about the effects of the mother being subject to violence or the fear of violence. And once the child is born, the effects of family violence on the mother continue to filter through to the child. Experiencing intimate partner violence can lead to mothers being emotionally volatile or withdrawn and impede a woman's ability to parent. Women can take their frustrations and distress out on their children, especially when they have to deal with children who are traumatized, tired, grumpy, and engaging in difficult behaviours, which are part and parcel of what's happening in the house. The repetitive nature of men's attacks on the mother-child relationship can lead to difficulty in women empathising or delighting in their children, connecting with the children. Women can stop intervening on the children's behalf and find it difficult to acknowledge harm to themselves and their children. The effects of traumatic stress can result in some women becoming emotionally distant or inhibited in their ability to care for their children. A lack of empathy on the part of a mother or primary caregiver is a very serious matter indeed. When a parent consistently fails to show any empathy, the child can drop those emotions from its repertoire. They cease to be wired for empathy. And when we are seeing serious violent offending, gratuitous offending, stomping on people's heads, stabbing people, and often going back just to give another kick for the hell of it, this is a lack of empathy. And probably they are not wired for it. And probably they are not wired for it because of what was happening in their early childhood. Babies catch negative emotions from their parents. 3-month-old babies of depressed mothers have been shown to mirror their mother's moods, displaying more feelings of anger and sadness and much less spontaneous curiosity and interest than the children of non-depressed mothers. These first few years of a child's life are crucial to the child's healthy development, including the child's later social development. One report on violence reduction stated, if a child's early experiences fear and stress, especially if these are overwhelming and occur repeatedly, the neurochemical responses to fear and stress become the primary architects of the brain. Research has shown the propensity to violence develops primarily from wrong treatment before the age of 3. And we have heard recently the longitudinal study from Dunedin indicating that there will be risk factors able to be identified in terms of future offending at the age of 3.5. Several studies have shown that male aggressive behaviour is highly established as early as the age of 2. In my role as a youth court judge, I've had to deal with some extremely disturbing, destructive and violent behaviour. And when we have the opportunity, as we do in the youth court with our multidisciplinary approach, to look into the backgrounds of these children in some detail, 70% of them have a history of care and protection issues, by which I mean there have been previous notifications to child, youth and family of abuse or neglect or other proceedings for their care taken in the family court. In 2011, a study of young people in New Zealand aged between 10 and 24 who had committed a violent crime found that 66% of the young people who had committed a violent offence had had a police family violence notification, meaning they had been exposed to family violence as a victim, witness or offender at some stage in their offending history. A higher percentage of repeat offenders had also been exposed to family violence compared with non-repeat offenders. While there is no single cause of youth offending, and so no silver bullet to address youth offending, my experience in the courts tells me that violence breeds violence. If a child grows up in a war zone, it is said, they will turn into a warrior. And when we add into that mix what I have described to you earlier, neurodisability, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, traumatic brain injury, mental illness, early onset schizophrenia connected with drug use, alcohol and other drug dependency, disengaged from school, post-traumatic stress disorder, perhaps from sexual abuse, becomes a very challenging mix. But the key to many of these underlying issues is family violence in the early years of life. And when these young people come to the youth court at, say, 15 years of age, not only are these problems well established, exposure to family violence will have been repeated over and over again. Clearly, every opportunity for an effective intervention must be taken from very early in life if we are to have any chance of effecting change. One of the clear challenges for the youth justice system is to have families and whānau front and centre when coming up with solutions, but also to take into account the possibility that home is where the violence has come from. In particular, the centrality of family group conferences and decision making can pose a problem if there is violence in the home. Additionally, there is a challenge of ensuring that, for example, we do not in the youth court bow young people to abusive homes because we don't know what's happening in the family court. We are endeavouring to address that issue arising from the two separate courts by having information sharing protocols between the family court and the youth court. But broader than this is the issue that for many young people in New Zealand, violence has already played a significant role in their lives, within their communities, or at least their families. Violence may have been used to assert power, to gain status or reputation, or as a normal or accepted alternative to expressing emotions. I know of one young person in South Auckland in a family of 9 that I visited just before Christmas. He's named after his uncle. Nothing unusual about that. I'm named after my uncle, and some of you men here may also be. But his uncle is a gang enforcer, a hard and violent man. His nephew thinks that he has to live up to the uncle whose name he carries, that he has an obligation to be hard and violent. And regrettably, he's well on the way to satisfying that. His exposure is to hard and violent men. In highlighting the problem of family violence, I don't want to be seen or thought to be demonising the families from which these damaged people emerge. As our Chief Social Worker, Paul Nixon, has observed, many parenting problems are underpinned by significant societal problems beyond the reach of social work alone. Tackling family violence often requires dealing with economic issues, poverty, housing, transport, structural issues around gender inequalities, sexism, and attitudes to violence. Police and court responses to violence in the home are often reactive and short-term and do not address the underlying causes. Addressing youth offending and family violence is complex and multifaceted. It requires a multifaceted response. But very importantly, it requires communities to be assisted to fashion responses that suit a particular community. National policies, in my view, can never fix a community problem. Policies can provide some overarching guidance and resource, but what drives offending in one community may be quite different to what drives offending in another. Even within one city, the responses need to be tailored for the constituent communities. I know from experience just how different offending is between Porirua Court and the Porirua area, where I sat as the judge and youth court judge for some 8 years, and areas of South Auckland. In my years in Porirua Youth Court, I would see an aggravated robbery perhaps once a year, and a serious act of violence perhaps once a year. And often the aggravated robbery would be stand over in the street, give me your hat or your shoes. That was my experience of serious youth offending. When I came into this role as Principal Youth Court Judge 5 or 6 months ago, I identified Manukau or South Auckland as a priority for me because the numbers were so high. My total court case list in Porirua was something in the order of 15. In Manukau it sits at around 200. When I went to my first day in Manukau, I had a day of 25, which were nearly all aggravated robberies, grievous bodily harm, ram raiding of service stations, and often a young person would be on 3 or 4 aggravated robbery charges, having carried out a whole series. And often the young people would be offending with adults, and so it was a different and much more serious picture. But it cannot be just a coincidence that South Auckland also has the largest number of family violence cases, with the highest level of seriousness of violence in those cases, and also the highest number of youth court cases, once again with the highest level of seriousness of violence. It's time for communities to step up and be engaged in confronting community problems. The future of any community depends on its young people being nurtured and assisted to make life better. Even the staunchest gang member wants a better life for his or her child. But in most cases, they have no idea how to achieve this. When I've been dealing with some family violence cases, and there's been children present, of course, while being judicial about it, my hackles are raised because I know this connection. And when I talk to defendants in the dock about their behaviour potentially leading their child to be standing where they are in the dock today, despite all the staunchness and lack of attention, the head goes down and often a tear flows. They know that they don't want this to happen, but we need to be assisting them to ensure that it doesn't. We are a very small country. Individual communities are even smaller, and it's not beyond us to make change happen. It is my priority to push for communities in South Auckland to be assisted to confront the drivers of youth offending, to have the drivers identified and addressed in the various communities that make up South Auckland, and to have the youth court with its multidisciplinary solution-focused approach engaged in that, assisting communities which are served by the court. In the youth court, we see daily the confluence of drivers of offending laid bare as we deal with the symptoms, the offences. And we can bring that special knowledge to the formulation of solutions. As I said at the beginning, I may have painted a bleak picture, but it's only bleak if it is seen as hopeless, and it is not. It is a challenge. But I am sure that community by community, real change can happen. We just need to start the work. Thank you for listening to me.
That very poignant address. The judge has time to answer some questions, if you would. Have we any questions?
Yes. Judge Barker, I'm interested in the question of the system's response to these circumstances. I've spent the last several years as chair of the Ministry of Social Development, Child and Family Complaints Panel that reports the Chief Executive. And we would hear these cases which are extremely complicated, but we're focused on child and family and their response to these circumstances. And they very much overlap with the courts, both the youth court and the family court. Issues like the veracity of affidavits, changes in direction by child and family social workers that might have an impact on the children. And as the Ministry of Vulnerable Children is just being focused on the question of how it should be organized and how it should deal with its own internal quality assurance processes, and also because our broad issue report on this very matter on the need for independent review of the way child and family are now the Ministry of Vulnerable Children deals with it. Do you have a view and an interest in the question of how child and family or the new ministry will go about doing this work and assuring that its own processes are protected?
I'm quite sure that the new structure is going to focus on the knowledge processes. And from my point of view, processes obviously need to happen and be in place, but I'm more concerned with identification of the underlying drivers of offending and communities and agencies focusing on dealing with the underlying problems. It may be that that's simplistic in the sense that I'm not much concerned about the processes. That's another responsibility of those that design processes and run agencies. My focus is on saying, what are the underlying causes here? What can this community do with the assistance of agencies to deal with them in their community? I think sometimes processes can be so complicated that they can camouflage the real issue. Two can go hand in hand, but not one at the expense of the other.
I'm Suzanne Sally, and I've been working in this area since 1993, well, since 1995 actually, and I'm delighted at your description of the problem because I agree that it's at least as bad as you described it. But what's been frustrating over this period is that despite evidence about things that can change it, it seems that we throw money at the symptomatic relief rather than actually at the solution. One of the solutions is, I think, Jan Loki's workplace protection bill. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but the concept is that most of the studies that I've seen, that the victims lack confidence in themselves. Another aspect of the behavior is they lack confidence in themselves. If they get jobs in the workplace, they get both the combination of the support of their colleagues and also the continuity of income, which allows them to deal with housing and schooling. I will send you a article if you have it. But it seems to me to be a way forward. And we've got the warehouse in ANZ Bank of New Zealand doing it. But one of the challenges is that although the state sector has approved that it should be in state sector contracts, the Ministry of Social Development recently, in their state sector contracts, decided not to go ahead with this policy. But that's another story.
Thank you very much. Just here first.
Gentleman behind East Church. I'm conscious of marking the challenge that you put on the table, well made, for this club to think about how we operate, but more particularly how we focus on our mission of making a difference. And so I'm interested in, as you spend your time, stretched time, and you come along and you speak with a group like this, and here we are sitting in central Wellington. We don't all live in central Wellington, many of us work here. And you set me wondering, what does a group like this do? What can a group like this do? Because I think you were holding up an issue for us that if we were to say, what are the most significant challenges that face our community and worth our attention? If this is not one of those, then I would be really surprised. And yet for a group like this to say, see, it's easy for it, and this is not in any way to define the personal commitment goes into planting trees or running fundraising events. Those are fantastic. But how would we make a difference in this space?
So that's exactly why I really accept invitations to talk to groups like this, because this is a community resource and it exists in various forms right around the country. So you have the experience and the knowledge and the abilities in this group to sit around the table and identify what it is of the drivers of opinion, say in Wellington for youth offenders or the wider Wellington area, and what you can do about it. And I was looking at one thing, one of the greatest protective factors against offending behaviour is a job. The young person that I'm dealing with on a daily basis in the communities probably is out of school and doesn't have a job, and they're drifting in the middle. Nobody in their household has a job. If you say to them, you know, you have to get up every morning 5 days, 6 days a week, you have to pray with it, you have to work on time, and you have to do as you're told, and you go have fun, and then you get some money at the end of that group. This is completely new to us. It's completely normal. A young man in Christchurch said to his social worker, after he'd got a job, they keep taking stuff out of my pay. What sort of tax? What's tax? Well, it's what keeps the country running. Yeah, but why should I pay it? What is it going for? You know that residence you were in when you were in custody? People didn't pay for all your meals. That's tax. Well, I mean, I'm paying for all of those people that were with me in residence. No, that exists. I'll pay for them. That's just an example of the paradigm that operates with these young people. So they need to be picked up, and they need to be walked with, and they need a resilient employer, and they need to get in the habit of going to work, and they need to have the comradeship of a workplace, and the mentoring that actually happens in a workplace, and they need to have the self-esteem of having a job.
Unintended Consequences. A young Christian friend of mine took his family into Randwick Park, which is a suburb in Manukau. He's a whitey, so it was quite a bold step to take. He started to work there with all of the situations that you have described. I've followed his progress over the last few years as he's done that. He got to the stage of having the community turn around and realise that the community could actually solve its own problems. He started to build, they built themselves a brand new skateboard park and a community centre. The council granted them the space to do that and the grounds which they developed. And he just built this community into quite a resilient and quite an effective operating community, and it continues on today. But the law, and he's developed a smorgasbord of job opportunities for the people in the community, so there's a whole lot of things that he's introducing them to, portfolio type work, so lawn mowing things where they don't have to have set hours, but they can get skills and they are employed. The law of unintended consequences has crept in because now Randwick Park has become more attractive as a suburb to live in, and the price of the houses has gone up, and the people who used to live there are being forced out here. So his last letter to me was, "What am I going to do now?"
Exactly the same thing happened in a place called Red Hook in New York, which was like a crime zone. And the court moved in a particular community-based focus, set up a court, and had a huge reduction in crime. Now it's all gentrified.
Yes.
Exactly that sort of.
Time for one more question.
So this is to follow up, I guess, Vanessa's question. So you talked about the power of communities to intervene positively, and you talked particularly about Porirua and Auckland. I happen to know both very well. And what strikes me about those two communities is they have high social deprivation, they have high incidence of domestic violence. They also have very strong communities. And I know the work you've done in Porirua. And I might want to just talk a bit more about how you've been able to harness the community in support of what you've done.
So what Roger's talking about is inspired by the Red Hook community that seems to work. What we did in Porirua, we came to the conclusion that courts operated on behalf of the communities that they served. They didn't get the power from anywhere else. Came from the legitimacy of the court comes from the community. But courts often off to one side in quite a separate institution. They're not seen as relevant, they're not part of the community. And it's very difficult for a court in those with that characteristic to respond effectively to what's coming in the door by way of opinion and fashioning responses. So Judge Kelly and I decided to endeavour to make the court more relevant to its community. And we spent 6 or 7 months just going out and meeting with every community group that would have us in the Porirua area. One group then arranged invitation to another, and on it went. So we ended up, I think, visiting some 40 groups in Porirua, asking what was happening, what were they doing, what could they offer the court, what could the court do better to respond to community problems. We learned a huge amount. We stopped there. As judges, we would have been hugely advantaged in what we knew what resources were available in our community. Before that, we knew our country. We then invited all of the groups that had been kind enough to talk to us to come to the court, to our place, we said, to have a one-day workshop answering the 2 questions. What could the court do to respond better to the community? What could the community do to assist the court to do that? 114 people turned up on a Saturday in Porirua. Roger, you might have been a part of that. We had every community group that we could think of represented. And a lot of themes came out of that. But more importantly, this huge line of communication between the community and the court was opened up. And we were besieged with offers of assistance, programs, interventions. And this relationship then developed and continued, and it particularly involved working with Iwi Ngāti Toa, who then looked at what we're doing in the youth group, because we've been doing that for a long time. In the youth group, the multidisciplinary approach, looking at underlying causes and having a team approach to offending. So that's the Polyrua model that has involved the court going into the community, which is a brief reference to what I said to you tonight about the court becoming relevant and engaged with the community that it serves in the South Auckland community. So my priority is to replicate that connection with the individual communities that make up South Auckland to 6 different highly distinct communities. No easy task, but it has to be done that way, assisting with the creation of solutions. Interestingly, Polyrua, as Roger says, high levels of deprivation, high levels of family violence, and nothing like South Auckland unemployment. But it hasn't had the same consequence in Polyrua. It's a strong community and resilient community. You would have thought that there might be some similarity between South Auckland and Polyrua. Nothing could be further from the truth. So something has gone on right in Polyrua that needs to be looked at, and the lesson learned for South Auckland.
Thank you, Judge Walker. It's nice to end on a note of hope, isn't it? I'll ask Derek to thank our speaker, please.
Well, I'm going to be very brief. I mean, I think you promised to start off by being a bit depressing, and you talked about all the what I think of as the predictive factors, the kind of the comorbidities of particularly the 0 to 3s, and what they're exposed to. You talked about the role of family violence, and you painted a kind of a gloomy picture, and then I think you did a really nice job of taking us through some of the protective factors. You had that wonderful expression, the merchants of hope, and I think you've finished on a really positive note, and I think an incredibly provocative address, and I think a real challenge to us as a club about what we want to do in this space. Thank you very much on behalf of the club.
Thank you, Derek. And we have some events coming up. The Kapiti Island visit on Saturday the 11th. John, you should stand up so people can, if you want to go, see this man.
Well, yes, it's actually we've finalised the bookings now.
Oh, right, you can't go anyway.
I guess if anyone is really keen, come and see me tonight, and we'll see if we can add to the bookings.
Bryden.
So it is Saturday the 11th of February, and it is a fantastic place to visit. It's really worth going there, and I haven't been for a number of years, so I guess the bird life is really considerable since I was there. Yeah, so come and see me if really are keen.
Thank you. And of course, we've got the Queen of Jumbo Tennis here.
You want to hear about baking?
Really briefly. You're always efficient anyway.
I am efficient. If you want to do baking for Jumbo Tennis, recipes are available.
And they need more teams, more volunteers, more food. Baking, yes. And for those of you who know Brian McEwen, rather sad news from him. He's been advised that he's got lymphoma. It's been caught early. He's undergoing treatment, including chemo, from either this week or in a fortnight's time. And Mark has pasted on our message of concern and sympathy to him. Next Monday, Waitangi weekend, don't go to Rotary. There will be a secret spy ready to fine you if you do. The 13th of February, Jerry Ford is speaking on the $1 million original fundraiser. 20th February, Rachel Holderness, Red Cross and the Power of Humanity. And thank you so much to our speaker. I think the combination of you plus Martin's prompt to us, it will be, there's a potential project there. And we certainly all need to think very hard about the sort of future we want for these children. Thank you to our visitors. Do come again. We always love to see you. And we'll see you when you can come in the next few weeks. And just to keep a sense of balance between youth and adulthood, youth doesn't reason, it acts. Adults reason, and would like to make others act in their place. Thank you.